So, I want to talk about baseball as a moment of time in human history. Um, we're looking at, so we'll break this down in like a deep time or deep history sense. That what we're looking at, when we're looking at human history, is really just a history of civilizations, and tribes, and ecosystems of culture, ways of being human, right? Across space and time. They're like nodes. We've discussed this a little bit already. They're like historical nodes or like stars. So history itself is a star system or star cluster of different civilizations, tribal concepts and notions of self and community, culture and cosmology. When we look at the detritus of these systems, we're really looking at the the clouds of debris, which are the dead stars, the graveyard of dead stars in history that form the sedimental layer of the earth, right? So these are the uh, ruins of the architecture of civilizations, cultures, and tribes. What's left, right? What's left is primarily, actually, in the sense that it's the most abstract, it's the most psychological, and thus the least susceptible to physical degradation in terms of literal architecture, buildings, structures, objects. We're looking less at the paintings. We're looking less at the colosseums, so to speak. We're looking at the stories, the narratives. And these themselves actually form the bedrock and the ground of the culture proper. Because these stories and narratives, as psychological constructs, inform through the mind, through the consciousness, through the body consciousness of the species proper as it's located in certain regions and speaks certain dialects, informs the construction and ultimate destruction of any civilization, any nation state, any tribe, due to the nature ultimately of the logical fallacies within this narrative construct of civilization or of tribe or of community. So when we're looking at the rise and fall of the American empire or the American civilization, we're looking really first and foremost in, if you want to take it in a modern concept, just stretch space time a little bit. When we're looking in America in 2025, back at ancient Greece, really what we're looking at is Plato. We're looking at the Greek theater. We're looking at the architecture of Greek civilization as a theoretical construct, which survives as long as it survives and then it dies out. What remains is Plato. What remains is the art. What remains are the theories and the psychological constructs and the philosophies, which themselves can be scarce. When you look at someone like Heraclitus, we're looking at just mere fragments, as well as the statues and the sculptures of ancient Greece, which again are often fragmentary. They're broken apart and rifted by the forces of nature, whether that's oceans, whether that's invaders, right? That's really what we're looking at. So the construct of culture is always, in a deep time sense, the historical ruins of what was. And reading through what was can help us understand the deeper psychological formation of any given civilization as a collective agreement or a construct, which is really always insulated. It's always a bubble. And these bubbles are popped by the forces of nature, by the real physical, structural, cosmological laws of the universe, which ultimately really is distilled in the nature of time and entropy. And the catastrophe of any given civilization is a failure to really understand and metabolize um, the real dictates, the real undergirding fundamental principles of how life functions, what life is, what nature is, who and what humanity is in the grand scale architecture of the cosmos. So, to return this to baseball and baseball history, it's a moment there in the American civilizational architecture, which is a period of time of around 1850, mid 1800s to the mid 1900s, I would say, really, which is the formation and then the golden age of baseball, which is created as a psychological construct in architecture of culture and play within this larger vision of American civilization, culture, history, and the economies, the political economies, which actually allow it to function in a natural sense. So, what I mean by political economies is that if you look at ancient Greece and the concept of the slave state and how that actually relates to America, again, the concepts of democracy and slavery are two things that are shared between the two civilizations, as well as an importance of athletic culture as primary, and often some of the great philosophy, such as Plato, emerges through athletic culture. Plato, again, was a champion wrestler, right, an Olympic wrestler. When you look at that emergence of culture in this period of time in American history, this 100-year period, it reveals, especially in a photograph like this is 1916, the World Series at Braves Field, Red Sox versus Brooklyn, reveals the place, the time, and the mind. I'm actually using baseball as a springboard here to deeper concepts, so I'm gonna keep deviating from baseball. The Greek theater itself is a perfect example of this, and you see it through baseball, and as we've discussed in the spiritual underlying existential concepts in baseball. The Greek theater functions to catalyze a cathartic experience in and out from under the subconscious collective consciousness in Greece at the time, due to the way its epics are structured and the themes that it approaches. It attempts to catalyze a consciousness shift within the culture. And what's so fascinating there about Greek theater is that it actually is something that is almost a form of civilizational rebellion and destruction, because if the consciousness proper of the Greek civilization actually does shift and metabolizes to a greater level of awakening and awareness, Greek civilization as we know it ceases to exist. So the civilizations are always pulled from two sides. They are pulled from one side by the forces of nature encountering the ballast or the bulwark of the civilization, the attempt to construct the walls of the city, and this nature of time as an eroding force of water and wind that beats against these walls and breaks them. So it's just the real entropy of time is one force. And then another force is the evolution of consciousness, which is inevitable in any civilization, which has cultural formations, because culture evolves first and then the larger collective political consciousness evolves second. And this is really the sweet spot in baseball, because we're talking about a ethnic, racial, segregated construct of American civilization, which is established by way of a brutal colonial regime, not only against the native people, but through transatlantic slavery, right, as well as exploitation of Mexican laborers into the 20th century, and Chinese laborers in terms of building the railroads that connected America initially. These railroads later become information technology. So the sweet spot here we're really hitting is that baseball itself as a cultural form is almost a ruse. It's a game and a guide for this deeper spiritual consciousness principle, which is the consciousness of American civilization proper is actually evolving through the evolutionary leaps that occur on the baseball diamond in terms of participation of different ethnicities, races, cultures. And as such, baseball is actually leading a consciousness evolution that actually spells the downfall of American civilization. And this is not necessarily a negative downfall, right? Because what baseball is doing is it's actually a vanguard into a deeper level of global consciousness, which breaks the former undergirdings of the nation state consciousness, which America anticipates, the establishment of the American empire and the drawing up of the borders and bounds and states that reside within the larger American national impulse. This is something that's solidified actually right at the time that this photo is taken in 1916 with World War I and the divvying up of the borders and bounds of the conquering and the conquered in World War I, right? Which again was really the world war that began to establish lines that we were drawing on a map, spaces that were definitively, even in terms of the nation of Germany, that were definitively certain places that had certain economic and political conditions, and a lot of the cultural fomentation and destruction creation that occurs in Germany during this period of time of 50 years between 1900 and 1915, which Nietzsche anticipates at the end of the 1800s. This period of construction and destruction of cultural identity in Germany is so much based around this. Who are we? What are we? Where are we? What are our myths? What are our legends? What are our beliefs? Even as the world is turning and ultimately turns away entirely from the nation state concept, even in the moment in which it's being established. So what Germany is feeling subconsciously in this moment in time is that the former regionalization or provincialization of these small cultural tribes and groups with their ethnic and cultural orders is being dissolved before their eyes by the wind and the wave of globalization, which the accelerating forces of that initiative are just as much industrialization in terms of technology as they are World War I and World War II. So when you look at America and you shift the lens, baseball is probably the most fertile cultural dynamic to discuss this globally, because it's born and it dies really in a 100-year span, which is that 100-year span of Nietzsche's anticipation of this new world, the emergence of this new world with World War I and Ferdinand, and the real just shattering and end of the previous world and the entry into this new world concept and new paradigm with World War II. So what we're witnessing at a deeper level than any sort of national history or economic or political history is the fracturing of a whole identity formation and a whole world order, which was formerly based on localized and regionalized concepts of self, which are national identity, ethnic identity, cultural identity in terms of actual pockets and regions and locales that experience a certain culture, a certain way of being. So we talked about baseball as a global culture and a world culture, and how it actually breaks free of the American bounds and creation myths, and is established and actually evolves radically and revolutionarily in Cuba. We talked a little bit about Venezuela and Mexico as well. We even started to touch on Japan. So the moment and movement that we're capturing is actually much more radical than just a creation and destruction of empires. If we were just going to examine Greece or Rome or Great Britain, if we were going to examine historical cultures, nations, tribes, we would see and we would understand a fundamental pattern of the rise and fall of belief systems and architectures that again are up against this ballast of time and of nature and of invaders and conquering forces. It's a narrative that repeats itself throughout history only because of a regionalization of humanity. And what I mean by regionalization is that just by the sheer nature of the limits of technology and transportation, people, places, cultures, and tribes are located where they are. And there might be the occasional venturing out of those bounds in terms of a Alexander the Great or Christopher Columbus or a tribe that is nomadic and thus is moving across different landscapes in search of food, water, shelter, new places to set up lifestyle and living. But what we're looking at in this specific period of 1850 to 1950, which is the period of American baseball becoming a world culture and a world cultural phenomenon, is we are witnessing it's a paradigm shift through that world globalizing force of transportation and the technology that allows for that, such as automobiles, such as airplanes, such as advanced shipping and submarine capabilities. This industrial revolution, which is really a technological revolution of space and time in terms of the access of space and time, and that's radically accelerated with information technology, the travel of information at the speed of light, right, through screens and through the internet. This rapid acceleration is actually the condensation of space and time, and it is making the physical principles that are actually discovered and really undergirded and reified fundamentally in a kind of fascinating. It's happening at the same time with quantum mechanics. It's localizing the globe, right? So formerly your locale would be your immediate physical proximity, where you could walk or you could ride a horse, or where you could speak and be heard, right? Maybe you could give a book to someone and they give that book to someone else, whether that's written or whether that's through the printing press. Warriors and armies would march, or they would ride on horseback, or they would take a ship, a very low technology ship, right, across different oceans and bodies of water, and hopefully survive that expedition. These breakthroughs, right, which are kind of the hidden technology behind colonialism, as well as they are behind the traditional conquering empire archetype, are rapidly accelerated through industrialization and industrial technology, and in turn create this final push. It's almost like a birth moment into this world culture, this world global culture, this event. So with that ability, what you're witnessing is something so radically new that there aren't words for it. And we still, to this day, right, 100 years later from this landmark moment that we're looking at in this photo, which is the onset of World War I, immediately after this photo is taken. You can see in the background the factories and this industrial structure, the smokestacks in Boston at this period of time. What you're witnessing, and what we're still witnessing to this day, and we haven't really put words to it, is the end of a paradigm that existed for thousands and thousands of years, and you can really say since humanity began, which is incredibly powerful, which is a paradigm of separation. It's a paradigm where communication, transportation, and travel was precarious at best and primarily located regionally and even locally. This moment, this is the springboard of the past 120, 125, 150 years, which has irrevocably changed the way that we conceptualize self and world through globalization, not only physically, in terms of immigration, movement of materials, war, uh, transmission of cultural technology, but in a deeper sense, and more recently, the hyper acceleration of that through digital information. So it's even funny, right? The paradox that we're looking at this photograph, which is a cultural technology, that communication of the literal realism of the subjective perspective of the photo as it's captured as a light technology and then developed, created as a physical object, which can then be published in a newspaper and sent to various different regions around the nation to document this game. And the World Series at this point was highly, highly documented. New York Times and most major newspapers in the country. It was a high priority event, even in the face of and in the midst of this rising world war. We're looking at this through a digital technology, right? I'm broadcasting this on the internet, which can then immediately be received as soon as I publish it on a media network to anyone who has internet access, as long as, of course, the website or application I posted on is not banned or censored, right? So that's the radical expansion, literally through the technology. It's a redoubling of that perception. Where I have this physical photograph, which was published in Physical News Media Technology in 1916, published around the country. I've taken that, it's digitized, and now it's published around the world in a micro instant. And that form of hyper acceleration is what we're talking about when we connect Greece and America, because it's not necessarily even that the American empire is dying. It's that the whole world mythology of empires, nations, tribes, regions, and locations is dying and being supplanted by a radical quantum mechanics of information technology, whether you want to call that quantum computing, whether you want to call that just simply the architecture of the internet and cloud systems, digital storage and transmission of information at light speed across space and time. What we've done really is that this scientific innovation and impulse of the early 1900s with scientists like Planck or Einstein or Bohr, that technology, right? We think of it in physical terms as the atom bomb or the shattering of the atomic structure. Really, what's happened at a deeper subconscious, psychological, consciousness-based level is that we've incorporated that philosophical and cosmological understanding of the architecture of the universe, and it is active in our technologies and our instruments, which then are our world creation and examination devices, which ultimately become the things themselves that break the borders and bounds of what was. And so baseball is the dying technology of the old world order, which again, bat and ball, it's entirely physical. It's a location. It's Newtonian in its physical concepts and constructs. It's located in that physical elemental world of the appearing real, right, of the formal construct of the atoms, of the compounds, of genetic information, chemical structure of the human being, and the physical principles which undergird mass, right, in space and time. Force equals mass times acceleration, right? These basic physical principles, which are the Newtonian former paradigm in which we lived as regionalized, atomized societies and cultures and civilizations. Baseball itself, through the racial, social, and cultural bounds and borders which were established to create the American empire, right? The political economic structure of white supremacy and who owned land, who controlled political access to power, etc., right? Baseball itself, as you can see in 1916, this was an all-white sport. It was an all-white sport from the end of the 1800s all the way to 1947 with Jackie Robinson, with the exception, right, of Cuban players and of Native American players, right? There was a segregation that was occurring much more in terms of black players, right? It was a skin color segregation. Um, the cultural construct of America as a caste system based on race is being broken really first and foremost through the cultural action of baseball. So we've talked about baseball as a vanguard revolutionary force of participation, and it itself being the foremost cultural artifact of American civilization, is that it is in advance anticipating the, I guess the term is the atomization and destruction and deconstruction of American civilization and the terms and conditions which built it. If you think about the foundations of America and the Constitution, all men are created equal, right? That's the cry of the Negro Leagues, right? And the cry of Black baseball is for inclusion in the infrastructure of professional baseball in America. You're looking at the foundations of American history being exhumed to create the conditions for inclusion almost before they are allowed, before they are confirmed, and before they happen at an American civilizational level. So if you think of the civilizational movement of civil rights in America, Brown versus Board of Education, desegregation of schools, um, Jim Crow era, right? The things that happened with Jackie Robinson, even beforehand in the late 1800s, with Fleet Walker, right, and Bud Fowler and these early Black baseball players, and this sort of integration of baseball, even in terms of players like Charles Bender and Jack Myers, who we discussed. Um, we're looking at the revolutionary movement of inclusion in American civilization, which is actually breaking the fundamental tenets of American civilization and political power, as in white men are the judiciaries and the executive branch of American civilization in terms of its power holders and power constructors. You think about during this period of time of 1916, you have the American industrialists, all of which are white men. You have the people who are in political power, all of which are white men. You have this nation that's being created and constructed and reified, and its power structures are all being controlled by this very specific ethnic and racial end group. And then even then, you have Italian players like Tony Lazzari or Jewish players like Hank Greenberg, and these again are white men, but there's ethnic difference in which there is actually a fair bit of ethnic discrimination and bigotry that's occurring during this period of time. So you're watching this breakdown in real time of this concept and construct of the American civilizational history of power through baseball, actually, again, referring to Jackie Robinson, that is anticipating the larger paradigm shift moment and movement, which is the death of American civilization and American empire, and the birth of a world and global consciousness, which we are now currently experiencing in 2025. It's the death of atomization in the introduction of a quantum mechanical architecture of space-time and of information and of humanity, which is obliterating these formerly regionally constructed difference constructs, which actually allowed for power systems. When we move into a real global political consciousness, we're shattering an entire paradigm that existed for thousands and thousands of years. Baseball itself is a cultural technology in America, and actually globally is anticipating this through in-group, out-group, and participation within the American cultural infrastructure. It anticipates not only mass immigration, but it also anticipates mass inclusion, not only by necessity, but by consciousness, right? Consciousness being information technology, the sharing of experience across the internet or across the cloud, and how that changes forever the formerly insulated cultural belief systems, which existed and which were allowed to be by the nature of the fact that there wasn't much else that was known or could be known, due to the fact that information was so sequestered or clustered in small local pockets. So you're watching this breakthrough in terms of the architecture that you see in the background of this photo, the smokestacks and the industrialization of America in real time. Moments after this photo is taken, America enters into World War I, the First World War, right? War itself becomes this technology of mass global integration, even through conflict. So this is what we're witnessing in real time. You have Jackie Robinson. You have the baseball barnstorming tours to Japan with Lefty O'Doul. You have baseball in Cuba, right, through Nemesio Guillo in the later part of the 1800s, and how Cuba uses that as a springboard to liberation, as a cultural technology. That's what we're witnessing, right? So that paradigm shift and that paradigm breakthrough, baseball itself is really a huge bridge technology. So we're looking at it at a deeper level beyond American civilization and into this paradigm shift of world and global consciousness and global information. And baseball itself being this anticipatory technology that is creating that in the old Newtonian paradigm through the physical form of the bat, the ball, and force equals mass times acceleration. And then it eventually moves into this quantum mechanical timeline of information technology, the speed of light, and a fracturing of form into a code system, really. Coding light, coding information. So that's what I got. This is some good stuff, I think, and I hope you enjoy. Catch you later.